Come along now from the sleepy little town of Saffron Walden, Essex, on a trip across the North Sea. It is November 1944. We go to Great Yarmouth and get aboard one of the Royal Navy launches that worked so closely with Saffron Walden Air/Sea Rescue Control throughout the war. It takes us all day to sail across to Ostend, Belgium, where in passing we see the great concrete E-boat pens built by the Germans, now housing British rescue launches. We drive through the flat, dreary countryside, past the rusting relics of the Wehrmacht retreat, through Ghent, through the fine modern city of Brussels, through St. Trond, and into the pendulous part of Holland extends farther south past Aachen on the German border. Through Maastricht we go, and through the tiny Dutch village of Wittem. All that's there in a tiny resort hotel, and it is overflowing with American officers, controllers, and signalmen. The front lines around Aachen are about 9 miles away, and we hear the incessant grumble of the artillery. We pile into a GI truck and start uphill, out of the narrow valley. The first deep snow is on the ground. The wind is blowing fiercely. It is very cold. On top of the hill we get out, lean into the blizzard and walk toward a collection of low huts. Beside them, on the very highest ground, stands a squat piece of apparatus supporting a pair of wide curving vanes that revolve deliberately, silently, ominously. We stoop through the windproof curtains into the door of one of the huts and enter a warm, crowded room. We have come to the vital brain of center of Nuthouse, the 8th Air Force MEW, microwave early warning, radar station, the most potent fighter control setup to come out of all the great developments of this war. Already obsolescence because of its limited 200-mile range, this MEW and /CPS-1 is still far enough ahead of the old type control to represent an epical advancement. For the controllers in this tiny mountaintop hut can see and follow virtually all the fighter and bomber formations within 200 miles in any direction, and all the enemy formations too. They can tell the friendly aircraft how far away the enemy aircraft are, and in what direction, and often how high they are. They have magic at their fingertips, and the controls of the bright green beam that scans each hooded fluorescent screen, sweeping in tune with the revolving antenna outside. This booklet is not going to give detailed information on PPI control, because all of what Nuthouse was and did was beyond the scope of activity of the 65th Fighter Wing. It was handled direct from higher headquarters. Nevertheless, this hilltop installation was so closely tied in with Saffron in the overall handling of missions. It was such a natural outgrowth of the control system we have already described, that something of its story must be included. The key control people who managed Nuthouse were all graduates of Saffron, and this was their background. Back at the Fork, when research work on long-range PPI control started in earnest, the first evidence of progress was when the RAF turned over for part-time American use its experimental Type 16 GCI stations at Beachy Head and Hythe on the south coast of England. American controller from Saffron, Sawston, and Walcott started working missions over France. And although the range was not great, they learned a great deal that was to help them later on. There was an attempt at liaison between Saffron and these stations because the GCI boys often had difficulty in identifying the right formations in their scopes, and the chief controller at the 65th could usually help them out by telling them the grid locations of particular groups. Lack of direct communications made this difficult, however. The big advantage of Type 16, as with all PPI instruments, was that the controller could actually see what was in the sky in its proper relation to the pilot's position. So in favorable circumstances, the T-16 control could even engineer a bounce of enemy aircraft by our fighters. Look down off your left wing, now, and you should see them, the controller would say, and like as not the pilot would. This study, the research, the experimenting went on, getting the bugs out of GCI, and finally the 8th got a station of its own, the first American MEW, which it installed on the east coast of East Anglia, where it would work out on the more frequent missions across Holland to Germany. This place was called Greyfriars, and it worked more closely with Saffron Walden. It was staffed by the control personnel who had originally gone to the T-16 sites. The whole point here is to show the teamwork which helped the program along. The 65th Fighter Wing is not attempting to take any of the credit for perfecting PPI control, but rather to show it as a parallel development to the progress already described in the more conventional modes of control. Greyfriars, as it were, advanced under the protective custody of Saffron and the other wings, ironing out all the difficulties, smoothing out the technique, getting ready for the day when it could move out to the frontier of the existing control limits, and thus double the effective range. And this it did, as soon as the Allied armies had swept far enough eastward to make the move practicable. The hilltop near Aachen was selected by signal experts from Air Force and Fighter Command, and after painstaking effort and heartbreaking delays, Nuthouse went on the air in November 1944. This is the general way the missions were handled after the MEW got going. At Nuthouse, enough equipment was provided so that controllers, working two at each scope, could handle all 15th Air Force fighter groups simultaneously. The groups would be controlled from England until they crossed in the continental coast, would be turned over there to Nuthouse, then turned back to Saffron, Sawston, and Walcott when they crossed out, all the way over Germany, at least as far east as Hanover. The MEW boys could steer their groups, help them rendezvous with the bombers, direct them to German formations, keep them clear of flak areas and other dangerous spots, and steer them on the right courses homeward. To further facilitate this control, a height finder radar, British Type 13, was used in conjunction with the MEW to get accurate altitudes on specific enemy formations. The very valuable homing services stood by, as always in the UK, to steer the returning aircraft to bases where weather conditions were suitable for landing. It was a pretty good team, altogether. Quite complete coordination was achieved by putting the chief controller at the MEW on the open conference telephone circuit with Saffron, Sawston, Walcott, and Pine Tree. There was a constant exchange of valuable information about the progress of each mission, and considering the fact that the telephone line had to run under the English Channel, AND, through miles of war-torn France and Belgium, the signal people did a good job in keeping it fairly constantly in service. In spite of all this, however, it was found impossible to check and coordinate every last detail of control over such a great distance, and more authority came to be vested in the Nuthouse personnel. It was obvious that whenever communications broke down, the forward control had to assume full initiative and even make major changes in the fighter dispositions to meet some unexpected enemy action. And even with the telephone working, there was still too much going on during a big mission to permit Nuthouse to refer all questions back to England. To give greater freedom of action to the MEW controllers to intercept hostile formations without too greatly disturbing the overall plan of escort, the fighter mission planners at Pine Tree consistently used the idea of splitting each of the fighting groups into A and B units, the A groups acting as assault forces free to rove under the guidance of control, the B groups to give close escort to the bombers. Some of the fighter group leaders had a hard time getting used to the idea of taking orders from a controller who could see more of what the enemy was doing than they could in the air. One of the most famous cases of convincing was the time Colonel Dave Schilling, rough and tough commander of the 56 Fighter Group, led 48 Thunderbolts into 250 plus Me 109s and FW 190s and came out with one of the best scores of the war, 35 enemy aircraft destroyed. It was 2 days before Christmas, 1944, when the Germans under von Rundstedt were making their all-out thrust into the Ardennes. Colonel Schilling's group was ranging across the Ruhr, and the Nuthouse controller, Lieutenant Gregg, steered him toward Bonn, Germany. All of a sudden, they ran into 20 or 30 enemy fighters heading the opposite direction, and Colonel Schilling was all for bouncing them then and there. "No, keep going," Craig told him. "Don't mess around with those bandits. They're small fry." Again, the group cited hostiles. Again, Control refused to let them fight. Dave Schilling fumed and stewed at the chances he was missing, but he stuck to the course the controller had given him. And after the truly terrific battle with the 250 Jerrys over Bonn, in which Colonel Schilling himself claimed 5 destroyed, the group's mission report had this to say. Group's commander's decision to spread squadrons on penetration probably interfered with Nuthouse control, and group leader regrets questioning Nuthouse's judgment in passing up small enemy units to vector group to larger concentration. MEW control should be followed implicitly. One technical development that should be mentioned here is Rosebud, a device carried by certain fighters of a group which identified those aircraft more clearly in the MEW scope. Although still experimental at the close of the war in the ETO, Rosebud was definitely proving itself of value in MEW combat controlling. One of the biggest things Nuthouse did for the fighters was to help them with navigation in bad weather. In December of 1944, when von Rundstedt started this Ardennes push, the 8th Air Force was called upon to fly all-out missions in the weather which up to that time had been regarded as absolutely prohibitive. The courage of the airmen during those dangerous weeks will never be forgotten by those who knew of it. At Wattisham, for example, the Mustangs of the 479th Fighter Group took off one morning when the fog was so thick it was impossible to see the runway from the control tower. The only clue anyone had as to whether each plane was airborne was to catch the dim silhouette as it crossed the point where the sun was trying to bore through in a dim orange ball. One squadron commander found something wrong with this airplane just after takeoff and asked permission to land and get another ship. The tower told him to circle and wait. A few minutes later, he was told to come on in and land. He replied on his radio, "Hell, I'm sitting at the end of the runway, waiting to take off again." Well, in that kind of weather, a group of fighters had to stick together in close formation or be lost altogether. And as they flew out eastward through the overcast or above the clouds, they had no sure way of knowing when they approached the German lines. And if they didn't spread out and commence taking evasive action when they got over German flak, they were vulnerable indeed, clouds or no clouds. For the German flak radar was too accurate for comfort. It was a great relief to the pilots as they knew they were getting near the lines to have Nuthouse come on the air calmly and in good humor and tell them exactly where they were, whether on course or too far north or south, and whether they were on time. During all this time, Safran still used a relay bomber, because many of the missions went on into eastern Germany beyond the MEW range, where again, the only source of information was in the Y service and in the reports from the bombers. In its tiny hilltop hut, Nuthouse had no facilities for handling the tremendous flow of details about the mission that were so well organized at Safran, so the two centers worked hand in hand. Later on, a small triangulation and fixture setup was installed at Nuthouse to relieve the 9th Air Force Tactical Control Centers of the burden of emergency homing of 8th Air Force aircraft to continental fields. See Chapter 3E. The fact that the MEW was thus able to take on so much of the heavy work of directing the missions made it possible to do what many responsible people in the 8th had wanted to do for a long time: consolidate the control in England in one place. Walcott Hall was closed down as a control center on January 1st, 1945, and Sawston Hall on February 1st, 1945, and control of the groups of the 66th and 67th Fighter Wings passed to the 65th at Safran. It is this final setup of control which is described in detail in the second part of this booklet.